Hours before anyone started asking questions about Richard Andrews, police in Moses Lake had already crossed paths with his grandson. They just didn't know it yet. For the officers, it was a routine stop. A report had come in about a vehicle, and they needed to verify the situation. Behind the wheel was 27-year-old Isaiah Thomas, a former college athlete. He cooperated. He answered questions. He made no attempt to flee. But something felt off. One of the officers recognized him immediately. They had attended the same high school years earlier. He remembered Isaiah as disciplined, competitive, someone with a future ahead of him. The man standing there now seemed completely different. The vehicle wasn't stolen. It belonged to his grandfather, Richard Andrews. At first glance, the situation appeared to be nothing more than a misunderstanding. Before letting him go, however, the officer made a phone call to Isaiah's mother, just to be sure. Isaiah left. The report was filed away, and no one connected that encounter to what would soon be discovered. A few miles away, Richard Andrews' family was becoming increasingly concerned. Richard was 75 years old. He wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without telling anyone. People who knew him could usually predict where he would be on any given day, either at home or at his mechanic's shop. His routine rarely changed. That was what made the situation so unsettling. His phone kept ringing without an answer. His wallet was still inside the house. Even his dog was still there. At first, there were simple explanations. Maybe he had gone out unexpectedly. Maybe he was busy. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But as the hours passed, those explanations became harder to believe. When relatives began trying to reconstruct Richard's last known movements, one name kept surfacing: Isaiah. According to him, he had seen Richard a few days earlier speaking with someone near the property. After that, he claimed he knew nothing more. For some family members, that answer wasn't enough. And it wasn't only because Richard was missing. For months, they had watched Isaiah change in ways they struggled to understand. There had been reports of paranoia, erratic behavior, and episodes that had drawn police attention long before Richard disappeared. They had no proof that he was involved in anything, but they also couldn't ignore what they had been seeing. Eventually, someone suggested checking Richard's workshop. If he wasn't at home, maybe there would be something there that could explain where he had gone. The property was only a few miles away. Richard spent a great deal of time there. Nothing about visiting it seemed unusual. What they found, however, there were tire tracks in areas where vehicles normally didn't travel. There appeared to be remnants of burned material, and one section of the property looked different from the surrounding ground, as if the soil had recently been disturbed. The family began examining the area more closely, and then they found Richard, buried in a shallow grave. Within minutes, what had started as a search for a missing relative became a homicide investigation. Officers arrived, the scene was secured, evidence technicians began processing the property, and almost immediately something else drew attention. Before forensic results existed, before there was an official theory, before the scene had even been fully processed, several members of the family were already pointing to Isaiah Thomas, not as a possible suspect, as the person responsible. For investigators, that reaction raised its own questions. It suggested there was a much larger story behind Richard's death, and understanding what happened to Richard meant understanding what had been happening around Isaiah long before the body was found. As the investigation expanded, detectives returned to Richard's home. The scene they had found at the workshop did not appear to be where everything had begun. Inside the residence, they noticed a strong odor of cleaning products. They also located small traces of blood and recovered a knife that was immediately collected as evidence. None of those discoveries on their own explained exactly what had happened, but together, they painted a troubling picture. The evidence suggested that someone had tried to clean parts of the scene. Someone had attempted to remove signs of violence. Meanwhile, interviews with relatives and people close to the family revealed a history of growing tension, ongoing concerns about Isaiah's behavior, and incidents that had worried those around him long before Richard vanished. Still, concern was not evidence. Suspicion was not proof. Investigators needed something that could establish exactly how Richard Andrews had died. That answer arrived with the autopsy. The findings removed any remaining uncertainty about the nature of the case. Richard Andrews had not died accidentally. He had not suffered a sudden medical emergency. Someone had attacked him. The examination revealed a fatal wound to his neck, along with injuries consistent with a violent physical assault. The findings also showed that his body had been moved after death and later buried near the workshop. The disturbed soil, the burn remnants, the effort to conceal what had happened, everything pointed in the same direction. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Who could prove it? For a time, that question threatened to slow the case. Investigators had evidence, they had forensic findings, they had growing suspicion, but proving responsibility in court required more than that. Then the case took a decisive turn. While Isaiah Thomas was in custody, new information began emerging from inside the jail. Details surfaced that aligned with what investigators had already uncovered through physical evidence and witness statements. The pressure that had been building throughout the investigation finally reached a breaking point. Eventually, Isaiah Thomas chose to plead guilty. He accepted responsibility for the death of his grandfather, Richard Andrews, and for the unlawful disposal of his remains. With that plea, the central question of the case was answered. Authorities concluded that Richard's killing had been carried out by a single individual. Despite the suspicions, tensions, and accusations that had circulated throughout the investigation, no one else was criminally charged. In the end, what remained was a family permanently divided. A 75-year-old man buried only a short distance from his own workshop, and a question that still lingers whenever this case is revisited. Could any of it have been prevented?